Atlanta is the hub of LGBTQ life in the South. And just to state the obvious, Georgia is also a state every presidential candidate wants to win.
Georgia has one of the largest, if not the largest in the South, LGBTQ plus population. And so in a state like Georgia that was won on the margins in 2020, it's a purple state, it's a competitive state. We know that every vote is going to count. And this is a community that turns out heavily in elections.
How are campaigns working to reach LGBTQ voters? And what does it mean to have an LGBTQ candidate atop the ticket for a prominent third party?
I lead with the fact that I'm a candidate for president, not the gay candidate, but I am a gay candidate for president. It is part of my identity. It's part of my life.
This week, a special Pride Month episode with guest host WABE digital editor Patrick Saunders. Plus, we'll talk about why Vice President Kamala Harris has become a regular in Atlanta.
Somebody asked me if I was moving here. I said, maybe.
And hit up a Metro Atlanta swimming pool to talk to voters about the upcoming presidential debate.
This is really important for Biden. He's better get a good night's rest. They better pump him full of fluids.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas. Co-host Raul Bally is away this week, and this is Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast. Joining us today is WABE Supervising digital editor Patrick Saunders. Patrick is a former editor at Project Q in Atlanta and the Georgia Voice. And now we're lucky enough to have him edit our politics stories that go on the web. Patrick, welcome to Plugged In.
Thanks so much for having me.
Patrick, you've got a story coming out as part of your ongoing LGBTQ coverage vertical called Beyond Pride at WABE.org. And you spent some time looking at how the presidential campaigns are engaging LGBTQ voters. But before we get there, can you tell me a little bit about what we know about this voter demographic in Georgia?
Sure, Sam. So LGBTQ voters are a highly engaged and a growing voting bloc in Georgia, as they are nationally. They're reliable Democratic supporters, so much so that they might have made the difference for President Joe Biden in the 2020 election. Nearly 90% of LGBTQ voters in Georgia voted for Biden in the 2020 election. That's according to an analysis of AP voter data. And of course, the state was decided by less than 12,000 votes that year. So getting those voters to come out again in force this year, as they did 4 years ago, will be a key to Biden repeating his success in Georgia. And that's what Georgia Equality Executive Director Jeff Graham reiterated to me in an interview.
There's been so much talk about people just being dissatisfied with the status quo, being dissatisfied with the choices that they have before them, and they're just going to sit this election out. We want people to understand that that too has very serious implications for the LGBTQ community.
And, LGBTQ voters, of course, care about a lot of the same issues as other voters, cost of living, housing, healthcare. But maybe could you talk to me about a couple of specific policy issues that touch the LGBTQ community really directly?
So LGBTQ people are strongly affected by non-discrimination laws, and that's especially as it relates to housing, employment, and public accommodations. There's a long history of LGBTQ people being discriminated against in those areas, whether it's getting evicted or fired or refused service because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And there's been a movement in recent years by local cities and counties in Georgia to pass such a non-discrimination law, as Gwinnett County did earlier this month. But there are no statewide non-discrimination protections in Georgia, which is something that LGBTQ advocates and groups like Georgia Equality have really been pushing for recently. Another issue is protecting and empowering LGBTQ youth. Now, here we're talking about anti-bullying measures. There's also been a growing number of restrictions or bans on books in school libraries that feature LGBTQ people or themes. And transgender youth have been targeted by policies when it comes to playing in a sport that matches their gender or getting gender-affirming medical care.
Okay, so let's stick with healthcare for a minute, Patrick. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, taking a look at the HIV epidemic, getting access and funding for prevention, testing, and treatment of the virus. This is something that heavily affects LGBTQ folks, gay men and trans women in particular. And it's an issue that's not gone away, Sam. It's still a major pain point. And Atlanta has the third highest number of new HIV infections of any city in the U.S. And while it might be hard to imagine, since this has been law for nearly a decade, same-sex marriage rights is another big issue. We have a very conservative U.S. Supreme Court now. And after the fall of Roe v. Wade, LGBTQ folks are very nervous about a similar fate for the Obergefell decision that legalized gay marriage.
Patrick, before we get to Washington, D.C., many of these policies that we're talking about are shaped under the Gold Dome at the state capitol here in Atlanta, where Republicans currently control the levers of power. What have we seen pass in this space in recent sessions?
Sure. So in 2022, as you and I closely followed, Sam, the legislature passed a law that empowered the Georgia High School Association to ban transgender boys and girls from playing on the school sports team that matches their gender. And shortly after Governor Kemp signed it into law, that's exactly what the GHSA voted to do. In 2023, the following year, the legislature passed a ban on most gender-affirming healthcare for transgender children. And in this year's session, Republicans in the legislature tried to expand that to a ban on puberty blockers for transgender kids. But that measure failed. And in fact, all the proposed measures that caused alarm among LGBTQ advocates in Georgia this session failed to pass, which was surprising considering the ramping up of such measures targeting LGBTQ folks in recent years.
All right, so let's extend that to Washington, D.C. What are some of the ways that control of the White House, of Congress, and the U.S. Supreme Court shape life for LGBT people and communities?
Yeah, let me count the ways. So with presidency, a lot of that power to shape life for LGBTQ people comes from their decision whether to sign or veto legislation passed by Congress. A president can also throw their weight around in Congress as a measure is making its way through the process, either to help it, pass, or squash it. An example of that is a hate crimes measure that President Obama signed into law that protected LGBTQ people, and a ban on the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that prevented gay and lesbian people from serving openly in the military. There's also executive orders. A president can also enact a slew of executive orders protecting LGBTQ employees and protecting LGBTQ kids in schools, and they can appoint pro or anti-LGBTQ federal judges who have lifetime appointments to the courts. And the Supreme Court's actions are, of course, huge. As I mentioned, the same-sex marriage ruling in 2015, the concern over that being stripped away. And in recent years, the court passed landmark protections for LGBTQ workers.
And you know, Patrick, I think you're right. The court's ability to shape American life in fundamental ways is so huge. I was actually a Supreme Court runner for a network news correspondent on the day that the Supreme Court handed down that decision on same-sex marriage in 2015. And the crowds that were gathered outside and around the country, as I'm sure you covered here in Atlanta, Patrick, reacting to that decision and such a sea change in American life in a snap was pretty striking to watch. I want to get to the candidates now in the race for president. And I'll start with the Biden campaign because Democrats are probably the most vocal as a party about preserving and extending LGBTQ rights. How is the Biden campaign working to engage these voters?
Yeah, so the Biden campaign this month launched a new organizing and paid media blitz for Pride Month to mobilize voters in Georgia and other battleground states. You know, they're running ads in LGBTQ media outlets. They're showing up at Pride events. Vice President Harris hosted a Pride reception this month in D.C. that included several Georgia folks. And President Biden will do the same on June 26th. And the campaign tells me they will have a presence at Atlanta Pride in October, but no word yet on who exactly they're sending to march in the parade. So they're really wanting to highlight Biden's record on LGBTQ issues. For instance, he's worked to reverse a lot of what was done during President Trump's term in office. Biden has appointed a record number of LGBTQ federal judges who will have lifetime appointments. He's enacted a number of protections for LGBTQ employees and children. And the campaign is really looking to make the distinction between Biden and Trump on LGBTQ issues very clear, as campaign spokesperson Kevin Munoz told me.
This is a community that turns out heavily in elections. So we have to talk to them. We have to define the stakes, and we have to show not just what the threat is that Donald Trump poses to this community, but also just what Joe Biden has done to have their back.
And Patrick, you reached out to the Trump campaign too. What did you hear from them?
Frankly, not much. I asked for a statement on why LGBTQ voters in Georgia should support President Trump, or for an interview with someone from the campaign to talk about his record on LGBTQ issues. They directed me to speak to the National Log Cabin Republicans, which is an LGBTQ Republican group. I tried setting up an interview with the head of that group, but so far he's been unavailable. This isn't exactly surprising given President Trump's record when it comes to LGBTQ people and the actions he took during his 4 years in office. He spent a lot of time reversing pro-LGBTQ policies passed by previous administrations. He enacted a ban on transgender troops in the military, removed protections for LGBTQ government employees, rescinded Title IX protections for trans students. And again, there's the importance of the courts again here. He appointed numerous anti-LGBTQ judges to federal courts, and they'll be making decisions for the rest of their career that could impact the LGBTQ community. And finally, one of his last acts was he filed a friend of the court brief in a Supreme Court case that said it was legal to fire people for being gay. So I'll keep trying to get someone to speak up for him on this and see what we come up with.
Now, Patrick, you've also been speaking with a history-making third-party candidate, Georgia's own Chase Oliver, who's gay and is the Libertarian Party's nominee for president. We heard from him at the very top of the show. Patrick, what's the significance of Oliver being in this very prominent spot?
Just having an out gay man on the ballot for president across the country is a huge deal, no matter what party they represent. And Oliver told me that while he doesn't lead with the fact that he's the gay candidate, he won't shy away from it, and he won't hesitate to talk through topics relating to LGBTQ folks, which he went into detail with me in our interview.
I'm ready to talk about those issues, particularly with voters who have lots of questions. Many voters just really don't understand LGBTQ issues. And so I'm ready to be there to be an ambassador to those issues and the idea that LGBTQ people deserve their freedom and liberty.
And the fact that Chase Oliver is from Georgia, from Atlanta, just puts an even bigger spotlight on Georgia this election year, Sam, if that's even possible.
Patrick, you've covered the LGBTQ community for a long time, and I wonder, have you seen an evolution in the way the candidates and campaigns are talking to LGBTQ voters and centering issues that matter to this community?
It depends on the party. For the Republican Party, that outreach is nudged forward very slightly. It's changed, but not by much. I've never seen a Republican candidate really have any presence as far as their campaign goes at any pride events or anything like that. And Democrats have historically supported LGBTQ rights much more strongly, but that support wasn't always visible. For instance, I used to work at local LGBTQ media outlets around the time of the 2014 races for governor and Senate in Georgia, and I couldn't get within 50 feet of the Democratic nominees to get an interview at that time. They held fundraisers with LGBTQ folks, but they were closed doors, and they didn't take part in Atlanta Pride. But that all changed by 2018. You saw Democratic candidates for offices statewide were marching in the Atlanta Pride Parade and continuing their support of LGBTQ folks, but just doing it in a much more open way. And that continues to grow in 2024.
Patrick, thank you so much for sharing your reporting.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam.
You can read and hear more of WABE's reporting on Georgia's LGBT community by checking out the vertical Beyond Pride at wabe.org/Beyond Pride. Time for a break. This is Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast. All right, we're back with more Plugged In. My colleague and buddy Patrick Saunders is going to stick around with us a bit longer and help out with the rest of this week's episode. Thanks, Patrick.
You bet. I'm glad to do it. Georgia politics is always busy, Sam, but we're in a wild stretch leading up to the July 4th holiday. And this week began with the runoff election. And a reminder for listeners, when no candidate tops 50%, the race heads to a runoff. And this was a bit of a sleepy election day. So what were your big takeaways, Sam?
All right, I want to talk about a pair of congressional seats that touch the Alabama border. In both, two former Trump administration officials will be the Republican nominees. Let's begin with one of Georgia's most closely watched contests, and that's the 3rd congressional district. The seat, which stretches out from Atlanta's south and east, will be safely Republican this fall. Ex-Trump aide Brian Jack and former state Senate Majority Leader Mike Dugan were the two finalists. Both had sterling conservative resumes, but Jack had the endorsement of former President Donald Trump, and that, Patrick, proved crucial. It is just another data point showing Trump's influence on the GOP. Now, I want to go to the 2nd congressional district in Southwest Georgia. Former Trump Education Department official Wayne Johnson defeated Chuck Hand. Hand was convicted of illegally demonstrating inside the Capitol on January 6th. He was among several January 6 participants who went on to seek political office. He lost, and now Johnson will face Democratic incumbent Sanford Bishop in November.
And on that same runoff election day, Vice President Kamala Harris was in Atlanta for 2 stops, a gun violence prevention event with rapper Quavo, and a Juneteenth block party to officially open the Democrats' coordinated campaign office in Atlanta.
And we're never going to let anybody take our power from us. We will never let anybody silence us. That's what this election is about. And the people of Georgia are going to make the decision. And the decision will be 4 more years. Thank you.
Okay, so Patrick, this block party had snow cones, barbecue, a DJ. Both campaigns are beginning to open offices and get field operations off the ground here in Georgia. You know, the Trump campaign, they opened one in Fayetteville the other week.
Our Trump headquarters, the first one in Georgia, is officially open.
That event featured former HUD Secretary Ben Carson, who summed up the presidential choice in November like this.
Would you rather have the surgeon who has a bad bedside manner but saves everybody, or the one with a very sweet personality who kills everybody? Which one would you take?
And you know, the Biden campaign, they've opened a bunch of offices.
And this comes just a few days before the first presidential debate, which will be right here in Atlanta. Sam, I know you spent time with voters at, did I hear this right, a swimming pool?
Yes, Patrick, when it's 100-degree heat index, where else do you go to find voters? I thought a swimming pool was the obvious choice. So I chose the Wills Park Pool in Alpharetta. This is a very swingy corner of Fulton County. And it's a suburb that used to be very red, but has turned more blue in the Trump era. In the open to the show, we heard from Madeline Ford, who says she's voted for Republicans and Democrats, but never Trump, and feels the stakes for this election are very high. She's the one who said she hopes they pump Biden with a lot of fluids and says she will be watching this debate. But I also heard from some undecided folks who say they think the debates are kind of pointless.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll watch, and do you think that'll make a difference?
Probably not. I don't know. I tell you, I mean, I'm just not motivated. You know, I don't know that I feel like my vote makes a big difference.
That is Carrie Webster. She was lounging in the sun reading a book when I caught up with her, and she says she's not happy with either choice this November, noting that Trump is a felon now.
I mean, he's a conniver. He's just not a good person. You know, he's really not. But the economy was better, you know, and Biden, I feel like, don't know that he does a whole lot, you know, for us. Hate to say, you know.
Okay, and did you meet any undecideds who say yes, they will watch the debate?
Well, Deanna McKay says she's struggled in the past with whether her vote really matters, but this time around she says she's really going to do her research. She's a millennial who voted for Trump in 2016 and Biden in 2020. Now she is not sure about who she'll vote for, so she is going to watch the debate with an open mind.
Socially, Biden, but like financially, Trump. And that's kind of a tough place to be. These aren't the two candidates that I would choose.
McKay says top of mind for her is affordable housing and reproductive rights, though she says she doesn't connect former President Donald Trump to that Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. And Patrick, it's voters like McKay that Biden and Trump really need to reach during the debate next week.
Well, I know I'll be watching that debate, and we'll be covering on air and online at WABE.org.
That is it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE politics podcast.
And you can get more Georgia politics online at our jam-packed election hub. Find it at WABE.org/election2024.
Plugged In is a production of the WABE Politics Desk. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick. Thanks to Patrick Saunders for helping us out today. Raul Bali will be back next week. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe button and leave us a review. It really helps. Next week, we will bring you a special debate night episode from the Debate Spin Room in Midtown Atlanta. See you then.